Thank you very much. So yeah, on the schedule, my talk is called the Folly of Chasing Demographics. It's all about demographics. I've called it "You Don't Know Your Users," open parenthesis, and you never will. And on my opening slide, I should say, because I've been asked to describe all my slides, as I should, there are three emoji depicted, and from left to right, the first one is a wheelchair user with a ponytail who looks quite sporty. The second one is a Sikh gentleman who you wouldn't know this from the emoji, but who is an orthodontist. And on the right, you have a non-binary person who's dressed up as a ghost for Halloween. I just need to make sure I can flip through my slides. So yeah, my name is Hayden. I'm variously a designer, a developer, an artist, a technical writer, and a videographer, if that's a word. The emoji used to depict me here, that doesn't look anything like me. To describe how I look, I have close cropped hair, and I look slightly depressed, and my eyebrows are far too dominant for my face. It's almost like a sort of a Hammer horror situation going on. And also I'm wearing a jumper which is covered in div elements, just div elements with no content. So HTML, which is of no value to anyone. The next piece of business here that I need to cover is the content warning. You would have seen in the listing for my talk, there's a content warning. This is because my talk references Nazism, terrorism, and addiction, just because these are subjects which happen to come up as I was writing the talk. I don't mention them in any more detail later in the talk than I really do in this slide. So in a way, there should be a content warning for this content warning. But I will say that I don't talk about any of these things in a favorable way. Okay, so let's get started. When I first met the Sri Lankan owner of my local corner shop in the UK, he asked me this question. He said, "Where are you from?" And I'm not used to being asked that because we're in England. And I said, "Well, here, like from around this way, where we are now." And he replied, "Yes, but where originally?" And I thought, but I'm a white English guy from England. And pictured on this next slide is a very small emoji of a violin, which is helpfully labeled tiny violin. This sort of thing happens to me all the time. The other day, I was in a coffee shop. As I left the counter to take a seat, an older man laughed, kind of hysterically, and said, "Are you Indian?" And I said, "No, I'm just white. I'm English. I'm from here." To which he said, "Well, you look Indian." To which I said, "Thanks. So do you." And at this point, obviously, I was contemplating the sort of absurdity of this conversation. And he replied, "Well, I am Indian." It wasn't sort of a white racist trying to police what kind of races come into his country. He was an Indian person who thought that I was also Indian, which made his remarks all the more flattering to me, but also all the more confusing. But white English people in England don't think I'm Indian. No. Many think I'm Chinese. This is based primarily on two factors. One, my hair is straight and also dark. And two, my wife happens to be Chinese. Usually they see the first thing, then they see my wife, and then they go, well, in that case, this must be how it works. How scientific. So where do people imagine my wife is from? Well, counterintuitively, Japan, at least 50% of the time. And the emoji depicted here is of a man doing a face palm. So I've tried to draw a diagram here which kind of captures the weird thinking of someone who would go down that line of thought. And that diagram involves two circles, which may or may not at some time have formed a Venn diagram, but they've not converging in the middle. They're just floating around in space. There's an upward trend line pointing towards the word ignorance. China, the word China is flung off to the left of the chart. The word Japan is flung off down to the bottom right. Floating in one of the circles is the term or the expression lack of self-awareness. And three bold arrows are pointing downwards towards the expression lack of social skills. Okay, so what about when I'm in China and I do travel to China to see my Chinese family? Am I the so-called token white guy there? No, as the only person not clean shaven, and I usually am not clean shaven at the moment, I'm fairly clean shaven. I must be a Uyghur Muslim because beards mean you must be Muslim, right? And I would just like to say Allahu Akbar to all my Muslim friends, since we're on the subject, but I'm not personally Muslim as it happens. And it's a really unfortunate thing when it comes to demographics, and I don't know if there's anyone attending the conference at the moment who's a member of the far right movement in America, but this idea that people who say Allahu Akbar are terrorists when a tiny, vanishingly small number of people are terrorists from any background. Some people are so confident in their demographic designations, they won't change them even when the subject of those designations, me in this case, corrects their assumption, which is really quite something, right? There's a lot of audacity in that. And this happens sometimes to me. For example, one time I was at the bar in a central London pub. The woman serving me had a wonderful Central or South American accent. And I can't stress this enough. I don't know which, because as I keep explaining, I'm an ignorant English white guy. And depicted there to sort of demonstrate my decrepitude, there's a turd emoji sat atop my head. Anyway, she asked me where I'm from, which a lot of people seem to do. And I give the usual answer that I have in all of the other examples, which is, oh, just here. Well, around here, not London, but nearby. Oh, for the Americans in the audience, just to be clear, this is the British Isles, which includes Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and England. This is not London. Not everyone from the UK is from London. I'm from Norwich, which is where I'm speaking from now. Anyway, she's not happy with my answer that I'm from here, that I'm from near London. She shakes her head at me, which is astonishing to me. I'm not sure what to do at this point. So there's an awkward silence. Eventually I say, okay, where do you think I'm from? And without even a momentary pause, she replies, Afghanistan, and says this with extreme confidence. Why did nobody tell me that I'm from Afghanistan? That would have been useful information, I feel. Allahu Akbar, by the way, to all my Muslim friends in the audience. What can we learn from all of this? Well, first of all, one, I shouldn't be a web developer or a technical writer or any of the other things that I'm occasionally paid some money for. I should be an international spy. And two, people should stop guessing other people's identities and by extension, their interests or needs. Just because someone has an axe and a beard doesn't make them a Muslim lumberjack. And they might just be an axe murderer who is sensitive about a slightly weak chin and is doing that thing by having a beard to disguise it slightly, which is their business. This talk is about about how both these people could very well use your web interface, the interface that you're working on, and how it's not your job to tell them apart. So first up, I just want to say that screen reader users are not always blind users. That's a demographic assumption. And the term blind is, of course, a very broad term, and it can mean a host of different things. It's just really a shorthand. What alt text would you use to describe this image? Perhaps something like, colleagues gather in an office environment. Three men look on attentively as their female leader points to something of interest on a computer monitor, while a fourth man with a neo-Nazi haircut has become mesmerized by his own striped necktie. And he's off in the background there. That is the only Nazi reference in the talk. We've got that out of the way now. And it's fair to say that some of the information here isn't really salient information. So this alt text could be edited, and depicted now on screen is that last sentence crossed out, because whilst it's in the picture, I don't think anyone really needs to know about it. Anyway, one time I made the mistake of using the following alt text instead. I used the blank empty string alt text, nothing, or sometimes it's called a null alt text, which is, if you're, not aware already, is the most reliable way to make screen readers not acknowledge the image at all. If you omit the alt attribute altogether, then sometimes they'll acknowledge that there's an image there, they'll read out the image or graphic role, and then they may replace what would be the correct alt description with the source or what have you, which isn't very helpful to anyone. My reasoning for an empty alt in this case, people who can't see this don't need to know about it because it's just generic corporate stock. I'm basically saying, well, this is terrible stuff. There's no need for it to be part of the interface at all. So why would blind people need to know about it? It doesn't tell them anything useful. But as I later realized, some screen reader users see something a bit like this, a blurred image. And others something a bit like this, an image with blind spots. So it turns out interest in generic corporate stock photography is more of a bell curve. People who can see it are immediately not interested in it. And that's universal. It's instantaneous. They just go, bleh, garbage, not interested in seeing that at all. People who cannot see it, and this is somewhat of an assumption, but people who cannot see it are probably not going to miss it. It is still corporate stock photography. However, some partially sighted users will sort of see it, but don't know it's just generic stock. They can't make that out. They need clarification. Context is also a factor. On a website where you might buy or steal stock photography, interest is higher for everyone because that's really the focus of what the task is. Of course, over time, another variable, this interest diminishes. It's still corporate stock photography after all. What is the lesson here? Is it partially sighted people exist? If you didn't know that already, then that's useful, but that's not really the lesson. Or is it not only blind, but partially sighted people use screen readers? It doesn't quite work like that. You don't just add each demographic as you encounter them. You have to assume that lots and lots of different kinds of people use these tools, and that's kind of the point. No, so the real lesson is design for the tools, not what you think you know about the users, because tools are shared and lives are not. Quick sidebar. Some people do not like the term user because they think it makes their audience sound like drug addicts. My advice is this: care less about certain connotations of the term user and focus on not making toxic or addictive digital products. The term user is appropriate because it's only through the use of your interface that you should come to know the person using it. You don't need to know them outside of that, and seeking to know them that intimately is super creepy and probably illegal if you're not above the law like Facebook or Google seem to be. Thank you. Depicted on the screen now is a computer monitor, and one arrow to its left is pointing up towards the expression normal user, and normal is in scare quotes. And attributed to that trend moving towards that term is normal interface. And then on the right-hand side, the arrow is pointing to the expression screen reader user, and that's labeled optimized screen reader interface, TM. One of the main reasons, besides privacy, that we shouldn't detect screen reader operation is that it enables us to put our limited experience and worst assumptions into action, tailoring those users a unique and uniquely awful interface. And visually here, some poo emojis have appeared on screen. Clearly, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Designing for the web is and should be designing in and for the unknown. And that applies to accessibility as much as it does responsive design. So the next kind of demographic assumption we make is that blind users are the same as other blind users, or to put it another way, all blind users are alike. And I have an anecdote about this. A few years ago, a blind screen reader user wrote something on a famous blog. It's a blog you've probably read if you work in web development, especially in front end. And what they wrote was that they shared their distaste for unordered lists, as in UL and LI elements in HTML. They found them verbose and distracting and preferred when people didn't include them in the HTML. They'd rather not have the noise. This precipitated a battle between well-meaning front-end developers, now armed with one data point, this single article from this single person, versus experienced accessibility professionals. And the conversation went something like this. Where's all the list markup gone? You're failing WCAG 1.3.1 all over the place. Blind people don't like it, so we got rid of it. Wait, which blind people? Didn't you read the article? The article? You can see how that would have surfaced. Taste is another thing we get distracted by as well. When a visitor to your website doesn't like it, we tend to feel hurt, but think, well, you can't please everyone. And pictured as someone vomiting and saying, I hate this website, it's gross. But when a disabled visitor finds it repellent, we tend to jump to the conclusion that it's inaccessible. If both visitors hate your website equally, it's not an accessibility issue. You've succeeded in creating a comparable experience for all your users, as much as your website is universally hated, which may be something you need to look into. Whenever I release a video for Brief Stock Video, which has the subject of accessibility, someone has to kind of catch me out by pointing out accessibility issues with the video itself. So people are always looking for this ironic thing. Oh, he's talking about accessibility, but he's done this thing which isn't accessible. The videos come with captions and transcripts, and they live on accessibly marked up web pages. They are pretty accessible. So these detractors have to get quite creative. Someone even said my videos aren't accessible because they include moving images. So I would say just be honest and say you don't like them, that it's a matter of taste, not accessibility. And let's talk about accessibility seriously and where it's appropriate. Misleading or plain bad experiences are not necessarily inaccessible ones. And pictured here is a hyperlink, or the HTML for a hyperlink. And what it says as the text node of that hyperlink is a nice video of a horse, but you can see that the href is pointing to rickroll.com. This link label, a nice video of a horse, is misleading because the link is really to a video of Rick Astley singing his famous hit. But it's not inaccessible because it's not discriminating in how it misleads. There is a parity of bad experience between, for example, screen reader users and screen reader non-users. Everyone is rickrolled equitably. What's the lesson here? Well, the lesson is Accessibility is about achieving parity, not popularity. There's no accounting for taste, but fortunately, you don't have to account for it when you're trying to make accessible interfaces and experiences. That's not a demographic thing that you need to concern yourself with. Be especially careful during testing. I once met a partially sighted user with an interest in graphic design. They wanted us to describe what the logo for the company name looked like. So something like thick, bulbous cursive in white, leaning gently to the right, spelling out the word bulb. But the logo was used as the homepage link, meaning it should describe the link's destination. And this is, if you go into the W3C's alt decision tree, and that's one of the one. If it's in a link, then it should describe what the link is doing. That's one of those long-standing rules and well-founded one. Bulb homepage was my recommendation to the organization as the accessibility expert in inverted commas, despite this user's feedback, because it's short, direct, and it's the information they actually need as a user and as a customer of the service. The case I had to make for this change was that disabled people aren't just disabled, and not all their interests are disability related. Who knew? Like, it's an obvious point, but it sometimes does need to be restated. So you tested with a disabled user. That's obviously a good thing, especially since you met a new person. But you only met that person, is the point. Your job is not just to give them whatever they ask for. They don't speak for everyone. The more testing you do and the more users you meet, the more you'll realize how unrepresentative your early encounters were of the non-existent uniform disability demographic that existed exclusively in your head. Ultimately, you'll learn the only things any of your users really have in common, disabled or otherwise, are brains, sphincters, and access to an array of tools and technologies. And since the brain and sphincter parts are really kind of a given, then you can see where your focus probably should lie. Another quick sidebar. That thing where you try to use a computer while wearing a blindfold, or lay on your own arm until it's numb, then try to operate a mouse. Yeah, you're not going to learn anything about disability that way either. If you can't already comprehend that having impaired vision or motor control is going to make life more challenging, then 20 minutes of disability cosplay isn't going to precipitate any kind of epiphany. I actually wrote about this a while ago, a few years back now, actually, on Medium, which is a terrible website, and don't know why I put it there. Probably because it was kind of a throwaway article. And the article was called "What Breaking My Claw Taught Me About Accessibility." Because I'd broken my wrist kickboxing after drinking too much absinthe, which is a long story, which I won't go into now. Anyway, thank you. Next one, screen reader users are not all power users, and not, for the most part, front-end accessibility experts, although obviously working within front-end, those are the kinds of people that you're likely to meet because they'll be your colleagues and friends. At the BBC, this is a few years back, we ABCD tested 4 differently coded tab interfaces for the gel design system. The one with the correct ARIA, according to advice given by W3C, performed the worst. Why? Because participants were not familiar with ARIA tab interface semantics or behavior. One participant thought they'd found some tags because they misheard the tab role as tag with a G. Multiple screen reader users in our testing did not know they had to use their arrow keys to switch tabs and got stuck. It was not a familiar interaction paradigm. Well, Some time ago, Paul Grenier of Dickey kindly gave me this testimonial for my book, Inclusive Components, and it reads, "No other reference example has been more perfectly plagiarized by as many UI developers as any single component from Inclusive Components," which is very kind of him to say. And I think it could be true that my ARIA tab interface implementation has been copied more than any other of its kind. Well, my advice is, and has been for some time, don't copy it if you can avoid it. And certainly don't put it in your design system, because then the whole organization will start using it. Not because it is a bad implementation, it's fine, but because it is a tab interface in the first place. Much as I'd love to say otherwise, live regions can also kind of suck for some people. Briefly, a live region is an element that announces its contents when they change, and pictured is an aside element with the attribution ARIA live equals polite, which is equivalent to role status, and an ARIA label of status. And now depicted underneath that is what happens when you populate that element. And in this case, we're populating it with the text, "You have a new direct message." And a speech bubble indicates that that would be announced in a screen reader. Neat. The trouble is, before ARIA live regions became supported, the only way to spontaneously announce some text was to move focus to that text programmatically using tab index equals -1, not tab index equals 0, because non-interactive elements should not be focusable by the user, just as a side note there. So anytime a live region is announced, users not familiar with them, and why should they be, would think their focus had just been stolen and moved. I've seen this in testing multiple times. Naturally, this can cause some confusion and anxiety. So there are, in fact, two ways that ARIA, or ARIA, depending on how you pronounce it, can make a web page less accessible. One, using ARIA incorrectly, and two, using ARIA correctly. What is the lesson here? Train disabled users in ARIA, or train screen reader users in ARIA. That seems like a big investment of time and money, and altogether kind of a cruel thing to subject to anyone. Stop using tab interfaces and live regions. Kind of, it depends in the context. But yeah, for the most part, probably. But it's really this, and that's do less in general. I did a talk a long time ago in Berlin for Beyond Tolerance, the Beyond Tolerance conference, which is write less damn code. And I stick by it today. I might redo that talk and give it again with more examples of how you can do nothing. You do less because most of what you do won't work. That's just the sad truth of it. To unpack that, nothing is accessible to everyone. Therefore, anything you add to your interface can only make it less accessible overall. Simplicity, or if you prefer, tersity, is the only panacea. For starters, you don't need to try and fail, because you will fail, to write the perfect alt text for this pointless stock image if you don't include the image in the first place. Remember that not everything needs to be accessible. Some things shouldn't exist at all. Of course, anything that exists should be accessible. This tab thing almost certainly should not exist anywhere when this plain content is evidently more robust, responsive, easier to operate, and less complex overall. And I should say, because I forgot at the beginning of this slide, the illustrations is a tab interface on top, and then underneath, for comparison, just some headings with some text in between them, as you'd see in just normal content on a web page. And these damn question mark button things are everywhere. Just little question marks in little circles, and you click on them, and then a pop-up thing appears. we're not hiding things, which is what that's doing, just unnecessarily hiding things from users, is astonishingly a better UX, not to mention an accessibility non-issue. Importantly, you don't need to know your own users. You don't need to dig into and try and work out the demographics to know these things. So you can stop creeping on them. Here's another one. Screen reader users are not always disabled users. Screen reader users are screen reader users. You may have heard this before. Accessibility isn't just for disabled people, it's for everyone. And there is a picture of someone throwing up next to that expression. No, accessibility is for disabled people. To say otherwise is a form of erasure. But that's not to say that the tools we commonly associate with disability, like screen readers, are not simply useful pieces of software. Screen readers are a source of text-to-speech, which has too many different uses to mention. For one thing, you can just turn a blog into a spontaneous audiobook or podcast. And screen readers are just one tool of many available to anyone who wants to use them. On the web, literally anyone could encounter your interface, and with a variety of different means. So designing it for a subset of people is inherently problematic. And I'm sure lots of people listening now have probably had this conversation where some stakeholder or someone says, oh, we don't have any disabled users. And you, of course, reply, well, yeah, and you never will, because you're obviously not designing for that to be the case. You never will with that attitude. But the thing about human diversity is it's really fucking diverse. So much so that your audience is fundamentally unknowable, meaning your research into that audience is really just an exercise in manufacturing preconception. It may sound cold and impersonal, but interfaces are just inputs and outputs. And you would do well to see them that way, I think. Your job is to create simple, logical interfaces, supporting the available inputs and outputs provided by the existing tools and technologies to achieve equivalent modality. Equivalent modality, the different kinds of input and output should make a comparable experience possible. Possible because not everyone is actually looking for the same experience anyway, and that's a whole other area to talk about. That is pretty much it. I suspect I'm a little bit under time. Succeed at non-exclusion where you would fail at inclusion. Thank you very much. As I said, my name is Hayden. If you want to reach out to me, I can be found on Mastodon on the front end social server, which is front-end.social. And I'm always available to talk about accessibility and my limited knowledge of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hayden. Fantastic presentation. Really appreciate your time.
Oh, no problem.
The chat and Q&A is very alive and well. I don't think anyone is. Maybe were there 3 poop emojis? I think we were
in the talk.
Yeah.
I think there's probably 5 or more in total.
5. I missed a couple. So just a reminder for everyone still watching, please take your questions to that Q&A section and then upvote your favorites so we can make sure that we get all of those addressed to Hayden here. Hayden, first question. Says, love the thoughtful presentation. So how do you teach or learn being that thoughtful and also detail-oriented, especially when everything around us is moving faster and faster, and the value is associated with being able to keep up with that speed?
Oh, wow. So that's kind of a general question about how to cope with being a front-end developer. I'm 41 years old and I'm losing steam rapidly with trying to keep up with everything. And I think really it's a question of, it's really about, so much of the new stuff that comes along is stuff that shouldn't exist and probably will go away quite soon. And so you can't learn everything. So what you have to try and do is develop like a radar for bullshit, really. So I never got into NFTs. Didn't waste my time with that. I'm not involving myself in AI. I don't have cryptocurrency. All of these things have come and are now ailing and are likely to go away again. So it's the same with anything which comes along in terms of the web technologies and what people do with them. Stick to learning and honing your understanding of the fundamentals, whether it's to do with the discipline of accessibility or whether it's to do with like the fundamental like primitives and things and in JavaScript, like learn how to do clever stuff with arrays rather than learning a framework which does clever stuff with arrays for you, because that framework will probably disappear. Just yeah, do learn, try and detect what the important things are to learn just those, and then apply them judiciously. Like I said, just don't try to do too much. There's no need to try and do too much, I think. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Another popular question here states, in my experience, it's difficult to undo the ideology and, quite frankly, uh, the crutch of demographics, personas, and the like, particularly with decision makers and leadership. Do you have any tips on ways to help disarm this type of thinking?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. So I think hopefully just being able to just using examples, I guess, just demonstrating. So with screen readers, the one that I always bring, the examples I always bring up are the one that I had at the beginning of the talk, which is partially sighted users and how there's really, in a way, there's no such thing as a decorative image, because any image they're going to want to know whether it's important to them or not. So what I learned from that is that far fewer images can be kind of ignored in terms of alternative text than I first imagined. But the other example I like to use is well, two actually. There's people who are English isn't their first language, and perhaps like hearing words is easier than reading them for whatever reason, because that's the way they've learned. Like that's the way I've learned Chinese. Certainly, my limited Chinese is all spoken Chinese, because I'm really not good at reading Chinese, because that language system in written form is so much harder. But yeah, it's that's that's pretty much it, I think.
All right, thank you so much. Let's see, another one. I've heard images like this, referring to one of the images early in your presentation, are called, in quotes, ambient images, which I agree definitely need alt text. Where is the line from a purely decorative and ambient image if we consider interest over time in the case of stock imagery?
That's really interesting. So is the contention that an ambient image is different from a decorative image, I wonder? The first thing I'd say is that the ambience from, so the corporate stock photography example I used, the kind of ambience that kind of instills in me, or it evokes, is not the kind of ambience that I want. I don't want to feel that I'm in some sort of corporate cubicle department or whatever. Obviously, like when I'm listening to ambient music, I tend to imagine that I'm somewhere else, like on a beach or somewhere nice. I'm trying to imagine what that kind of image would sound like, and I guess if it were ambient, it would be kind of like dark ambient. It is like a subgenre of dark ambient, and it would probably be the sound of like a sort of metallic scraping, but detuned and then reverberated heavily, but in a very dissonant and atonal way. But I think I'm probably going off the point there. But yeah, as I said, I think there's the difficulty for me sometimes, or it has been in the past, is I really want to kind of do things for certain demographics or users of certain tools that I can't otherwise do, I'm going to have a really bad time trying to convince an organization that they shouldn't be plastering their web pages with adverts all the time. But what I did used to do quite a lot is I used to put ARIA hidden equals true on all of those adverts, because the stakeholders and the people in charge, they didn't know what ARIA hidden does. And I thought, well, I'm doing people using screen readers here a favor, because then they can just go past those things. But actually, that's a real assumption, because as much as I'm kind of allergic to consumerism, not everyone is. And for me to make that decision for them that they don't need to see these or experience these adverts puts me in a problematic place, I think.
A bit of a assumption of taste, right?
Yeah, exactly. So again, it's guessing demographic, right? So the point is parity. Again, it goes back to what I was saying about um if it's an equitable or if it's a comparable bad experience, then you've actually done your job. So if it's plastered with adverts and is an almost unusable interface because of that, then that should be the case also for someone who's using a screen reader, which may be a disabled user. So
Yep.
yeah.
There are some folks asking for the famous article that you mentioned. You don't have to mention it now if you don't want to, but I'll tell the
Oh,
audience that. Oh, please go
should I
ahead.
drop it in the? I'll try and find the link and I can drop it in the
If
chat.
you can get it to me, I can get it to the audience.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's fine.
And then let's see. Let's go on to another one here. Lots of questions coming in. At one point earlier in your talk, you mentioned in quotes, design for the tool. Could you clarify what you mean by that?
Yeah. Like I said towards the end of the talk, about how interfaces are really just inputs and outputs. The your when you think of something like a screen reader can be used in so many different ways by so many different people with so many different abilities and so many different preferences. Um, there's not many things that you really know enough to make assumptions about. If you sort of mean like screen reader users would want this kind of experience using their screen reader. So when I say designing for the tool, what I really mean is make sure that in terms of output, everything is available. In terms of input, everything is available. Um, and then it's up to the user to pick and choose those things. And screen readers themselves have preferences for turning off certain levels of verbosity. Leave that up to them to do. Don't make those decisions yourself. Don't make the mistake I did of saying, well, a screen reader user probably wouldn't need this information. Make sure the information is there. If they're not interested in it, they can skip past it, or they can reduce those verbosity settings. So I'm just saying, yeah, just make sure that the interface is compatible. And it sounds really cold. It sounds very, like I said, very impersonal to think of it that way. But if you do start to think about what are these kinds of users like and what do they want, you're going to get into trouble really quickly. And you're going to start making mistakes, and you're going to end up giving the wrong information or not giving enough information, or giving too much, like when using screen reader only text everywhere that a lot of people do to supplement things. And actually, some people won't, that they'll be confused because they'll hear the text, but they won't see it. So sighted screen reader users, but also you've already got a problem with your interface if you need to do that for it to be understood non-visually. So it's really more of actually an information architecture problem than it is a demographic related problem. So yeah, it's just make sure that the tools work with your interface. Leave everything else up to the user of those tools.
Fantastic. I think we've got time for one more here. This one's a little bit longer. It states, while I agree with the fundamental concept, that your audience is unknowable in general. I think there are some kinds of applications where you do or can know your audience, specifically where your users are clients paying to access you what you provide, like in a B2B use case. Can you
Mm.
convince me that even with deep research, this specific audience is unknowable?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So I mean, I guess I would say you know who they are currently. I mean, the classic one is where you're saying, oh, we know that these people in our audience are not disabled people. And that may actually literally be, say your audience is only 15 people. It's a tiny application for a small, like an intranet thing or something like that. Um, one of those people might leave, and then a disabled person would come along and replace them. And then you are dealing with a disabled user, or not necessarily even a disabled user, but a user who has different ways of doing things, different preferences, uses different tools or what have you. So I don't think you can ever really know um, who you're going to be dealing with, especially not indefinitely. But there's also two tracks there as well. There's people who are interested in corporate stock photography for whatever reason, because they're buying and selling it, or probably more likely stealing it. You know that audience is only going to be there because they're interested in that product or in that media. So you do know certain things like that, but you only really know um, what you're offering, if you see what I mean. What I'm saying is not to make assumptions about how people consume that media or how people would purchase those products or in what context or what time of day or any of those variables. So yeah, in business to business cases, you're going to have you're going to have a stronger idea of the kind of people you're dealing with, but they might not indefinitely be the same people. And the question of what their abilities are and their preferences and how they use interfaces, um, that's something you should probably feel less comfortable about making assumptions over, rather than as opposed to their taste or why they're there in general.
Got it. Thanks, Hayden, so much. Fantastic presentation. I can tell you that
Thank you.
folks in chat absolutely loved it. A lot of folks found it quite hilarious, and there's a lot of, laughing out loud, and a lot of appreciation for the obvious care that you put into the presentation. So thank you very much for that. Um,
Thank you. No, thank you. I really enjoyed being part of it.